The winter of 1873 arrived in the Tennessee Hill Country, not as a season but as a sentence. Fern Callis had 3 days of cornmeal left, a cracked chimney that leaked more smoke than it held, and a 6-year-old boy named Tobias, who had stopped asking when supper would be ready because he already knew the answer. She was 22 years old. She had been a widow for 4 months. Her husband, Edmund Callis, had been crushed beneath a felled oak on the last warm afternoon of September, 2 men from the sawmill carrying him home on a plank door with their hats in their hands. He was 31. He had owed 3 months of back rent to Harvest Doane, the man who owned every acre of workable land between Kettle Creek and the northern ridge, and who had ridden out to the cabin on the 1st of November to inform Fern that grief was not a currency he accepted. She had been trying to pay the debt herself, taking in mending, selling eggs from their 4 remaining hens, walking 4 miles each way to the Doane mill town to clean laundry for the foremen's wives. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough. Harvest Doane had made certain of that. On the morning of December 9th, the frost inside the cabin windows was so thick that Tobias had drawn a horse in it with his finger. Fern stood at the door pulling on Edmund's old work coat, the sleeves rolled up 3 times to find her hands, the wool so worn at the elbows it had gone sheer as gauze. She was going to the creek to break the ice for washing water. After that she did not have a plan. She had gone 20 yards from the porch when she smelled the blood. It was the copper and iron smell of it, sharp under the clean cold air. She slowed, her breath clouding around her face. The snow along the creek bank had been disturbed, not by an animal, the tracks were wrong, and there was a dark smear across the white crust that led her eyes down the bank and into the creek bed itself. A man lay half in, half out of the frozen shallows. He was face down, one arm extended, his hands submerged in the dark water running beneath the broken ice. He was enormous, built like a draft horse, wearing a heavy canvas duster soaked black across the left side. A rifle lay 3 feet from his outstretched hand, and beside it a leather dispatch case that he had apparently been clutching when he fell, its strap still looped around his wrist. Fern's first instinct was to back away. Every woman alone on the frontier understood the arithmetic of strange men, and this one had the look of someone who had not always been on the righteous side of a transaction. There was a long-heeled knife scar running from his right ear to the corner of his jaw, and when she stepped closer and saw his face, she could see that even unconscious and hypothermic, there was nothing soft in it. But he was breathing, barely, in shallow stuttered pulls, but breathing. She thought of Edmund, of the men who had carried him home on a door and wept openly, grown sawyers weeping in her yard, because Edmund Callis had been the kind of man who gave his last dollar before he gave his last breath. She thought of what he would say if she walked away. "You foolish woman," she said aloud, to no one, to herself. She grabbed his collar. He outweighed her by 100 pounds at minimum, probably more. Moving him was less like dragging a person and more like convincing a felled tree to cooperate. She could not get him up the bank in one pull. She went back to the cabin, took the rope from the barn peg, looped it under his arms, and used the porch post as a brace. It took her 40 minutes. She broke a blister on each palm and tore the knee out of her only good skirt on a submerged root. "Mama!" Tobias appeared in the doorway, his eyes enormous. "Who is that?" "Someone who needs help. Come hold the door." Between the 2 of them, a 22-year-old woman and a 6-year-old boy, they got the man inside. He lay on the braided rug before the hearth and dripped creek water onto Edmund's good floor, and Fern knelt beside him and cut his duster away with the kitchen shears because the buttons had frozen shut. What she found underneath was not encouraging. He had been shot once, on the left side below the ribs. The wound was not fresh, a day old, perhaps more, and it had been packed with what appeared to be a strip of torn flannel, already saturated. There was bruising across his ribs that suggested he had also been beaten, deliberately, by men who knew what they were doing. His lips were the color of slate. "Tobias," Fern said quietly, I need you to do exactly what I say, and not ask me questions until I'm finished. Can you do that? He was 6, but he was Edmund's son, and he straightened his spine and said, Yes, ma'am. She set water to boil. She sterilized Edmund's boot knife in the fire. She found the whiskey she had been saving. For what? She had never quite decided, and she used it on the wound before she used it on herself, which seemed like the correct order of operations. The bullet had not passed through. She could feel it against her fingertip when she probed the wound, and the man, deep in some gray country between consciousness and death, made a sound when she touched it that she would not soon forget. It took her the better part of an hour. When it was done, she sat back on her heels with the lead ball in the tin cup, and her hands shaking so badly she could not have threaded a needle if her life had depended on it. Tobias brought her a cup of water without being asked. She drank it and did not cry, because there was too much left to do. The fever came that night. The man, she still did not know his name, burned like a banked coal. He thrashed against the rug and spoke in fragments that made no sense, and some that made too much sense entirely. He said the survey is wrong 3 times. He said they've already bought the judge twice. Once clearly and with great precision, he said a name, Harvest Doan. Fern went very still. She sat beside him in the firelight and listened. He was not confessing. He was warning someone in his delirium, warning someone who was not there and could not hear him. But she heard him. She heard him say that Doan had sent for men from Nashville to ensure the survey came back wrong. She heard him say that the creek rights were the whole point, that whoever controlled the water table between Kettle Creek and the ridge controlled the only viable mill site for 40 miles, and that the families currently living on those creekside parcels were obstacles, not neighbors. Her land was a creekside parcel. She looked at the dispatch case. It was wrong to go through a man's private correspondence. Edmund had raised her better than that, she thought, and then opened it. The man's name was Callum Stead. He was a county surveyor, licensed by the state of Tennessee, and he had been hired by the Territorial Land Office in Nashville to conduct an independent assessment of water rights and property boundaries in the Kettle Creek district. His notes were meticulous. His maps were extraordinary, hand-drawn in 3 colors with notations so precise she could follow them without knowing half the terminology, and what they showed was damning. Harvest Doan had been filing false boundary claims for 11 years. He had manipulated the county deed records through a circuit clerk he had in his pocket. He had bought water rights that were not legally his to buy, from families who did not know those rights could be separated from the land, who had signed documents they did not understand because Doan had provided the lawyer, and the lawyer had been Doan's cousin. The Callis parcel, her parcel, Edmund's parcel, Tobias's inheritance, sat directly above the primary aquifer. The creek that ran behind her cabin was not incidental. It was the source. Doan did not want her to leave. He wanted her to leave without knowing what she was leaving. Fern closed the dispatch case. She sat for a long time in the dark, listening to the fire settle and the man breathe and the wind test the joints of the cabin walls, and she felt something happen inside her chest that was not grief and was not fear. It was colder than either of those things and considerably more useful. In the morning, the man was still alive. His fever had broken some time before dawn, and when Fern came in from the barn, she found him propped against the stone of the hearth, watching the door with the alertness of a man who had learned that relaxing his guard was a mistake. His eyes were the color of creek water in July, gray-green, clear, and startled. "You're in my home," Fern said, before he could reach for anything. "You were shot, and you came off your horse in my creek. I pulled you out." He looked at his hands, then at the bandaging across his ribs, then at her, which seemed to cost him something. "Callum Stead," he said. His voice was a ruin, hoarse from fever and cold. "Fern Callis." She set the milk pail down by the door. "You owe me 2 yards of cotton lawn. I used my best petticoat to pack your wound." Something moved in his expression that might, under better circumstances, have been a smile. "Mrs. Callis," he said. Yes, she went to the fire. Can you eat? He could eat. He ate everything she put in front of him, which she noted was not the behavior of a man accustomed to being waited on. He ate like someone who knew what it meant to be hungry and understood that food was not a given. She filed that away. Tobias came in from where he had been hiding behind the woodpile, watching through the window. He came in with the directness of a child who has decided that a thing is safe and sees no reason to pretend otherwise. "Are you a lawman?" Tobias asked. "Land surveyor." Tobias considered this. "What's that? I measure things. Draw maps. Figure out who owns what. Do you know who owns our land?" Callumstead looked at Fern. She kept her face neutral. "Your mama's land," he said. "My daddy's land. He died." A pause. "I'm sorry, son." Tobias sat down cross-legged on the floor beside the man's feet, with the easy, unconscious trust of a child who has not yet been taught that the world is mostly dangerous. "Mama cried for a long time," he said informatively. "She doesn't anymore. She says crying doesn't chop wood." Callumstead looked at Fern again. This time she looked back. "It doesn't," she said. "He stayed 7 days because the snow came in hard on the second morning, and by afternoon the road to town was buried past navigating." Fern did not tell him she had read his survey notes. She watched him instead, cataloging him the way she had learned to catalog everything since Edmund died. For usefulness, for risk, for whether what a thing appeared to be matched what it was. What Callumstead appeared to be was a difficult man who had learned to do without difficulty by making himself useful. On the third day, moving slowly and stopping often, he split the remaining firewood and stacked it against the south wall of the cabin without being asked. On the fourth day, he spent 2 hours with Tobias, teaching the boy to tie knots from a coil of rope he found in the barn, in the patient, low voice of a man who did not consider the company of a 6-year-old beneath him. Tobias showed him his carved horse. Callum turned it in his hands with genuine attention and said it was good work, which it was. Edmund had carved it. That night Fern found herself talking. She had not talked, not really, since Edmund died. There was no one to talk to who knew how to listen. But Callumstead listened the way her husband had, without waiting for his turn to speak, and she told him about Edmund and the oak tree and the 4 months since, and the debt to Doan that kept growing like something alive, and the mending and the laundry and the eggs, and how it was never, ever going to be enough. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "It's designed to not be enough," he said. "The debt. He adjusts it. He has a man at the county office who keeps the records however Doan needs them kept. That's what the circuit clerk is for." She let the silence sit a moment. Then, "You know about Harvest Doan. I was hired to find out about Harvest Doan." He looked at the fire. "The land office in Nashville has been getting complaints for 3 years. Families leaving, selling for nothing and leaving. The patterns flagged an audit." He paused. "That's what's in the dispatch case." "I know," Fern said. He turned to look at her. "I read it," she said, "the night of the fever. I needed to know if the men who shot you were coming to my door." He held her gaze for a long time. "That's fair," he said finally. "Your maps show my creek. Your creek is the whole reason this is happening. I know that too." She folded her hands in her lap. "What I don't know is what happens next. You're one man with a survey case and 2 bullet holes. Doan has 6 men on his payroll that I know of, a crooked county clerk, and a judge he bought sometime before the war. And you have the original survey," Callum said, "in the hands of a licensed state agent, which makes it a government document. And you have the dispatch case, which contains 11 years of documented fraud." He paused. "And I have a name in Nashville, a federal land commissioner, not a local judge. Federal." Fern was quiet. "It takes the circuit court out of the equation," he said. "Doan can't buy the federal bench. Not with what he has. Can you reach Nashville from here? Not until the road clears." He looked at the window, at the snow still coming down. "But there's a telegraph line at Hester's Mill, 6 miles east. I know where it is, when the snow stops." "I know where it is," she said again, and her voice was steady as the stone of the hearth. It stopped snowing on the fifth morning. The world outside was blinding white and perfectly still. Fern had the horses harnessed before Callum was fully awake, and when he came out to the barn, still buttoning his coat, she handed him the reins and climbed into the wagon without discussing it. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not entirely read, and then got up beside her. They left Tobias with the nearest neighbor, a widow named Agatha Brent, who lived a half-mile up the ridge and who took the boy in without asking questions. Because women on the Tennessee frontier had learned not to ask questions when another woman's face looked like Fern's face looked that morning. They were 3 miles from the cabin when the riders found them. There were 4 of them. They came down off the ridge trail at a canter, spreading wide across the road in the practiced way of men who had done this before. The man in front was not Doan. Doan did not do things himself, but Fern knew him. His name was Prentice, and he had come to her cabin twice before with papers and a smile that never reached his eyes. He did not have the smile now. "Miss Callis," he said, pulling up. His eyes moved to Callum, and then to the dispatch case on the seat between them and went flat. "You're going to want to turn that wagon around." Callum Stead set the brake with his foot. "I'm a licensed agent of the Tennessee Territorial Land Office," he said. His voice had not changed. It was the same voice he used to explain knots to Tobias. "I'm traveling under government authority. You're obstructing a federal survey. Harvest Doan." "Harvest Doan," Callum said, "does not outrank the federal government. Neither do you." He paused. "And there are 3 witnesses on this road right now. Prentice, think about what you want to be a witness to." Prentice's hand moved toward his coat. Fern had not told Callum about the rifle beneath the wagon seat. She had put it there herself at 4 in the morning while he was still asleep. It was Edmund's Sharps, the one he'd used for deer. And she knew exactly how it worked, because Edmund had taught her on their first autumn together, saying that a woman alone on this land needed to know how to use every tool she owned. She brought it up smooth and unhurried and rested the barrel on the side of the wagon box, pointed at the center of Prentice's chest. "My husband taught me to shoot," she said. "He was a patient man and a good teacher, and I practice regularly." She kept her voice the same temperature it had been when she told Tobias crying doesn't chop wood. "You are going to move off this road." Prentice stared at her. Behind him, the 4 riders shifted in their saddles. Callum Stead, she noticed peripherally, had drawn his own revolver with the quiet efficiency of a man who had prepared for this before she had. "The dispatch case goes to Nashville either way," he said. "The question is whether you want to add armed obstruction to Doan's list of federal charges, because it will be a federal case. That's already been decided." A long moment. The horses breathed plumes of white into the cold air. Prentice pulled his reins left. The 4 riders opened a gap in the road. Fern kept the Sharps where it was until they had passed, and then she set it down in her lap. And she did not let her hands shake until they had rounded the bend and the riders were out of sight. Then she let them shake for exactly 30 seconds, and then she stopped. Callum was looking at her. "You put that rifle there this morning," he said. "I did, before you knew they'd come." "I knew they'd come," Fern said. "I just didn't know when." He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the reins again and clicked to the horses. "Edmund Callis," he said, "was a lucky man." "He was," Fern said, "and he knew it." The telegraph at Hester's Mill went to Nashville in 40 minutes. The federal land commissioner, a man named Augustus Greer, arrived in the Kettle Creek district 12 days later with 2 deputies marshals and a sealed warrant. Harvest Doan was arrested on a Wednesday, which was the day he always held court at the general store, surrounded by the men who worked for him and the people who owed him money. The deputy marshals walked him out in irons in front of all of them, and Fern stood in the back of the gathered crowd with Tobias at her side and watched it happen. Doan looked at her as they walked him past. His face had gone to something ugly and uncontrolled, the mask he wore stripped away. "You had nothing," he said. "You had nothing, and you still had the wrong land. Edmund couldn't work it. You certainly can't. You'll lose it anyway. Fern looked at him the way she looked at a fence post. Edmund worked it fine, she said, and it's not your concern anymore. The federal commissioner's office voided every deed transfer Doan had filed under fraudulent pretenses. The county clerk was indicted. The circuit judge resigned before the federal inquiry reached him, which was not the same as innocence, but was close enough to satisfying. The Callis parcel, confirmed by Callum Stead's survey as sitting above the primary aquifer in the Kettle Creek Valley, turned out to be of considerable interest to the Nashville and Chattanooga rail line, which needed water access for its planned western expansion, and was willing to pay an annual lease that would have seemed like a fiction to Fern 4 months earlier. She did not sell. She had learned something about the difference between selling and leasing from a man who drew maps, and she applied it. Spring came to the Tennessee hills the way it always did, reluctant, and then sudden, the creek running high and cold, and the redbuds coming out on the ridge in that particular shade of pink that always made the hills look like they were blushing. Fern was on the porch when she heard the horse on the road. She had known he would go. He had never said otherwise, and she had not asked him not to, because she understood the kind of man who could not stay still in a closed space. Callum Stead had mountains left in him, surveys left to run, a government contract that ran through the following autumn. He had told her that honestly in November, and she had respected the honesty even when it cost her something to hear it. But he had written 3 letters since December, the last one from Knoxville, and the letters were not the letters of a man who was finished with a place. The horse coming up the road was a roan she recognized. Tobias, who had hearing like a barn cat, erupted off the porch steps and was running down the road before Fern had finished standing up. She watched her son run, watched the rider pull up and swing down and catch the boy who launched himself without hesitation, and she pressed her hand flat against the porch post and breathed. Callum Stead walked up to the porch with Tobias on his back, one hand gripping the boy's ankles and one hand holding his hat. He looked at Fern. She looked at him. The redbuds were brilliant on the ridge behind him, and the creek was loud in the hollow, and she could smell the first warm soil of the season, the good dark smell of it that Edmund had always said was the smell of promise. The northern contract came through, Callum said. The land office wants the Overton County survey run by August. He paused. It's 12 miles from here. I know where Overton County is, Fern said. I'd need a place to winter after. She studied him. He stood there with her son on his back and his hat in his hand and met her eyes without looking away. The roof on the barn needs replacing before autumn, she said. I've been putting it off. I can do a roof. San, the south fence line is down in 2 places. I can do fence. And Tobias, she said, needs someone to teach him to read properly. I've been doing my best, but I was never a patient teacher. I can do that too. His voice was careful, deliberate, like a man setting down something heavy in exactly the right place. I'm a patient man. Fern stepped down off the porch and crossed the yard. She stopped 2 feet from him and looked up at his face, at the scar along his jaw and the gray-green eyes, and the expression in them that she had been turning over in her mind for months like a stone with something valuable underneath it. You should know, she said, that I am not easy to live with. I have opinions about most things, and I do not keep them to myself, and I will never again sign a paper I do not fully understand. I would never ask you to, and Edmund's land stays Edmund's land in the deed. I'll not change the name of it. I wouldn't want you to. He said it without hesitation, without the flinch she had half expected, and she understood that he was exactly what she had catalogued him as over those 7 winter days, and that she had catalogued him correctly. All right then, Fern said. The warm spring wind moved through the creek hollow, carrying the smell of thawed earth and cedar and the distant sweetness of the redbuds opening on the ridge, and in the yard of a cabin that had outlasted a hard winter and a false debt and a powerful man's long reach. A woman who had learned that crying doesn't chop wood finally let herself believe in the particular kind of miracle that does not announce itself, that simply walks up the road on a spring morning and stays.